The year was 1847, and in the dusty heart of Cedar Ridge, Texas, the devil himself was holding court. He wasn't a creature of horns and brimstone. He was just a man with a hammer, standing on the courthouse steps, selling human lives under the blistering sun. Men were gathered in the square, shouting numbers like they were bidding on cattle at a stock show, their faces flushed with greed and cheap whiskey. On the block, 5 young women stood in a line, their dresses tattered, their futures evaporating with every crack of the auctioneer's gavel. 4 sisters had already been sold to pay off a gambling debt their father had racked up in a crooked poker game. They were gone, led away by strangers to fates too grim to imagine. Only one remained. Her name was Sarah Mae McKinnon. She was 16 years old, and as she stood alone on those splintered wooden steps, her green eyes burned with a fire that defied the hell she was in. Her auburn hair was a tangled mess, but she held her head high, refusing to let these men see her break. The auctioneer, a weasel-faced man named Pete Hawkins, pointed a grimy finger at her. "Last one, folks," he crowed, his voice slicing through the thick, hot air. "Sarah Mae here, young, strong, and spirited. Do I hear $20? A beefy bachelor named Jake Morrison, known more for his fists than his wits, bellowed, "20!" The hammer rose. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. This was the end. And that's when a lone figure stepped out from the shade of the general store. He was tall, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke, and his face was a roadmap of hardship and loss. He moved through the crowd with a quiet authority that made men step aside without even realizing they were doing it. He stopped at the edge of the dust-filled square. His voice was low, but it cut through the noise like a thunderclap. $100. A stunned silence fell over the town. Even the auctioneer froze, his hammer hovering in midair. $100 was a fortune. It was more than all 4 of her sisters had sold for, combined. The stranger's gray eyes locked onto Sarah's. There was no pity in them, no lust. There was something else, something she couldn't name. He took another step forward and spoke the words that would shatter her world, and then rebuild it from the ashes. "I'll take her," he said, his voice ringing with conviction across the square, "but not as property, as my wife." The town of Cedar Ridge held its breath. The sun beat down, the dust hung in the air, and for the first time in a very long time, Sarah Mae felt a flicker of something she thought had died forever. Hope. But she was wrong. It wasn't hope. It was the beginning of a storm, and she was standing right in the eye of it. She just didn't know it yet. Pete Hawkins, the auctioneer, finally found his voice. It cracked like dry twigs. Did you say $100, Mr. O'Brien?" "I did," the stranger replied. His name was Daniel O'Brien. Sarah knew that much. He was a widower who kept to himself on a ranch a few miles out of town. A man shrouded in a quiet grief that seemed to hang around him like a winter coat. Daniel walked toward the courthouse steps, his boots stirring up little puffs of red dust. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He never took his eyes off Sarah. "I'm offering $100, Daniel said again, his voice growing stronger, more resolute. "And I'm offering my name. Sarah Mae McKinnon, if you'll have me, I'd be honored to make you Sarah Mae O'Brien. As my wife, not my slave. As my partner, not my possession." A wave of murmurs and gasps rippled through the crowd. This wasn't how these things worked. A man didn't just propose marriage on the auction block. It was scandalous. It was unheard of. It was a direct challenge to the order of things in Cedar Ridge. Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. This man was offering her a choice. A choice. After watching her sisters be sold off with no say in the matter, the very concept felt foreign, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. She started, her voice a dry whisper. "I don't even know you, Mr. O'Brien." A sad, weary smile touched Daniel's lips. "No, Miss McKinnon, you don't. But I know you. I've seen you in town. I've seen the way you held your family together when your father was falling apart. I saw you hold your head up high when men who weren't fit to shine your boots whispered behind your back. I saw you give half your meal to a stray dog last winter when you barely had enough for yourself." He took off his hat, revealing dark hair threaded with silver at the temples. "I'm not asking for your love, Sarah May. I'm asking you to let me give you a home, a life, a chance to be treated with the respect you deserve. The rest, we can figure that out as we go." Sarah's gaze swept across the faces in the crowd. She saw her neighbors, people who'd known her since she was a baby. They had stood by and watched her family be destroyed. They had watched her sisters be led away in tears. And now they watched her, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity, curiosity, and contempt. Then she looked back at Daniel O'Brien, this quiet, sorrowful man who was offering her the one thing no one else would: dignity. She found her voice, and it was stronger this time. "Will you treat me as an equal?" she asked, her chin held high. "Not as something you own?" "I give you my word," Daniel said, his voice solemn, "as God is my witness." Sarah took a deep, shaky breath. The air tasted of dust and despair, but for the first time it also tasted of possibility. "Then yes, Mr. O'Brien," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, I will take your name." A low rumble of disbelief went through the crowd. Hawkins, the auctioneer, looked utterly bewildered. "Well, I'll be. This is highly irregular," he stammered. He looked at the sheriff, Tom Bradley, who just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Hawkins shrugged and brought the hammer down with a loud final crack. "Sold! To Mr. Daniel O'Brien!" But Daniel was already moving. He climbed the steps and extended his hand to her, not to pull her, not to command her, but to help her. She placed her small, trembling hand in his large, calloused one. It felt surprisingly warm, secure. "Reverend Miller," Daniel called out, his voice booming across the square. "Would you do us the honor? Right here, right now. I want every soul in this town to know that this woman is Mrs. O'Brien and she is under my protection." An elderly man with a kind face and a flowing white beard stepped forward. "It would be my honor, Daniel," the Reverend said, his eyes twinkling. "The finest thing I've seen in this town in a decade." And so, on the very same steps where she was meant to be sold into bondage, Sarah May McKinnon became a bride. The ceremony was a blur of hurried words and the stunned faces of the townsfolk. It was sealed not with a kiss, but with a firm handshake that felt more binding than any vow. As Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, a strange feeling settled in Sarah's chest. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was a sense of surreal safety, like a shipwreck survivor washing up on an unknown shore. She was safe from the storm, but she had no idea what dangers this new land might hold. Daniel led her to a powerful black stallion tied to the hitching post. He lifted her onto the horse's back as if she weighed nothing, then swung himself up behind her. "My place is about 3 miles out," he said, his voice close to her ear. "It's not much, but it's sturdy. You'll have your own room. Until you decide otherwise." Sarah wrapped her arms around his waist to keep her balance. He was solid as an oak tree. As they rode away from the gawking crowd, the wind whipped her hair across her face, and for the first time all day, she felt the sting of tears. But these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of confusion, of fear, and of a tiny, fragile spark of something she dared not name. The ride was mostly silent. The rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves was the only sound against the vast, empty prairie. Sarah studied Daniel's back, the way the muscles moved under his simple white shirt. Who was this man? What kind of man pays a fortune for a stranger and offers her his name? Was he truly a saint? A grieving man trying to do one good thing in a cruel world? Or was he something else entirely? The question echoed in her mind with every hoofbeat. His kindness felt too sudden, too complete. In her world, nothing good ever came without a price. She couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't escaped the auction at all. She had just been sold to a different kind of master, one whose motives were hidden behind a mask of quiet decency. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. She was married to a stranger. She was riding to his isolated home, and no one in the world knew where she was going. Daniel's ranch was just as he'd described it, simple and well kept. The small wooden house had a sturdy look, with a covered porch and clean windows that glinted in the fading sunlight. A vegetable garden grew in neat rows out back, and a solid barn stood beside a fenced-in corral. It was a peaceful place, an orderly place, almost too orderly. "It's beautiful," Sarah said as he helped her down from the horse, and she meant it. Compared to the chaos and shame of the morning, this quiet homestead felt like a sanctuary, but sanctuaries could also be prisons. He showed her around the small house. The main room served as a kitchen and sitting area, dominated by a large stone fireplace. Everything was spotless, almost unnervingly so. It didn't look like a place where a man lived alone. It looked like a place that was waiting for someone. "This one here is the master bedroom," he said, gesturing to a closed door. "And this." He walked to a second door at the end of the short hallway and placed his hand on the knob, hesitating. "This was meant to be a nursery. It's yours now, for as long as you want it." He opened the door. The room was small and bare, except for a simple cot and a small wooden chest. The air inside was still and smelled faintly of fresh paint and heartbreak. Sarah could feel the ghost of a dream lingering in the corners. "What was his name?" she asked softly, sensing the depth of the wound she was touching. Daniel's jaw tightened. James Patrick O'Brien." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which was somehow more painful than if he had cried. "He lived for 3 days. They stood there in the doorway, two strangers bound by a bizarre contract, sharing a moment of profound, unspoken grief. Sarah had lost her family. He had lost his. Perhaps, she thought, he understood her pain more than anyone. But then, as she looked around the tidy, silent house, another thought pricked at her. "Cholera," the town had whispered. It took his wife and son last winter. A terrible tragedy. But cholera was a messy, violent illness. This house was pristine. There was no trace of sickness, no lingering smell of medicine or death. It was as if they had simply vanished. That evening, they sat on the porch swing as the sun bled across the horizon. Daniel had given her a simple cotton dress that had belonged to his late wife, Catherine. "She would have wanted you to have it," he'd said quietly. The clean fabric felt like a luxury against her skin, but wearing a dead woman's clothes felt like wrapping herself in a shroud. "Tell me about her," Sarah said, breaking the long silence. "Your wife." Daniel stared out at the prairie, his face unreadable in the twilight. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "Her name was Catherine," he finally said, his voice soft as dust. "She had a laugh that could make the bluebonnets bloom out of season. We met at a church social, knew from the moment I saw her." He paused. "We had 5 good years, then the sickness came." It was the story the whole town knew, a story of love and tragic loss. But as he spoke, Sarah noticed something. His hands, resting on his knees, were clenched into tight fists. His knuckles were white. He spoke of love and loss, but his body screamed of anger, of rage. The feeling of unease returned, stronger this time. This wasn't just grief. It was something harder, something sharper, something dangerous. Later that night, as she lay on the narrow cot in her new room, sleep wouldn't come. The house was too quiet. The silence seemed to press in on her. She thought about her sisters, Elizabeth, Mary Catherine, Hannah, and Rebecca. Where were they tonight? Were they safe? Were they afraid? A wave of guilt washed over her. She was here, in a clean bed, in a safe house, while they were out there, at the mercy of cruel men. She had to help them. But how? She had no money, no power. She was beholden to the stranger sleeping in the next room. Driven by a restless energy, she slipped out of bed. The floorboards were cool beneath her bare feet. She crept into the main room, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace. Her eyes were drawn to a large, locked chest in the corner of the room. Daniel had said it held Catherine's things he couldn't bear to look at. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, gnawed at her. What was in that chest? Mementos of a lost love? Or secrets? Her heart pounded as she knelt beside it. The lock was simple, an old iron one. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on the fireplace poker. It was a long shot, but she had to try. With trembling hands, she inserted the tip of the poker into the keyhole. She wiggled it, twisted it, listening for the telltale click. Nothing. It was solid. Defeated, she was about to give up when her fingers brushed against something taped to the underside of the chest. It was a small, flat key. Her breath hitched. He hadn't locked it to keep others out. He had locked it and hidden the key so he wouldn't be tempted to open it, or so he wanted it to seem. With fumbling fingers, she slid the key into the lock. It turned with a quiet, satisfying click. She lifted the heavy lid. The chest was filled with Catherine's belongings, dresses, a book of pressed flowers, a silver-backed hairbrush. But underneath it all, tucked into the corner, was a small, leather-bound diary. Sarah's hands shook as she picked it up. This felt like a violation, a betrayal of the man who had saved her. But the feeling of wrongness, the sense that something was deeply amiss in this house of sorrow, was stronger. She had to know. She took the diary back to her room, and by the light of a single candle, she opened it. The first few pages were filled with joy. Catherine's handwriting was elegant, her words full of love for her husband, Daniel, and excitement for their coming child. But as the pages turned, the tone began to shift. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. October 12th. Daniel had another argument with M today. The shouting was terrible. I don't understand their business, but it frightens me. Daniel is so angry lately. Not at me, but at the world. At him. M? Who was M? Sarah kept reading, her blood turning to ice. November 5th. M was here while Daniel was in town. He said things, terrible things about the McKinnon land. He said their father is a fool and will lose it all. He has a plan, a dark plan. He laughed when he said it. It was the cruelest sound I have ever heard. The McKinnon land, her family's land. A cold dread crept up Sarah's spine. November 20th. I told Daniel what M said. I told him we have to warn the McKinnons. But Daniel, he became cold. He told me to stay out of it. He said it was business, that M was a dangerous man, and we couldn't afford to make an enemy of him. This isn't the man I married. The last entry was dated December 1st. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible. He knows I know. M was here again. I feel unwell, a fever. Daniel says it's just a winter chill, but I saw the look in M.A.'s eyes. This is not a sickness, this is a punishment. Daniel is gone to Cedar Ridge. He won't be back till morning. The baby. God, protect my baby. If anyone finds this, do not trust M. Do not trust. The sentence was left unfinished. Sarah slammed the book shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cholera. The whole town believed it was cholera. But this diary screamed of poison, of murder. And who was M? She scanned the pages again, her eyes catching a name mentioned in an earlier, happier entry. A description of a town gathering. Catherine, my dear wife, even managed to make Morton Clay smile. Morton Clay, the wealthiest, cruelest man in the county. The man who had placed a bid on her at the auction, his eyes cold and assessing. The man Daniel had outbid. It wasn't a rescue, it was a business transaction. Daniel hadn't saved her from Morton Clay. He had bought her from Morton Clay. They were connected. And her family, her sisters, they were all caught in the middle of a war she didn't understand. The quiet, grieving widower was a lie. The safe house was a trap. And she, Sarah May O'Brien, was a pawn in a deadly game. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sounded like a threat. Sarah sat on her cot, the diary clutched in her hands, her mind racing. Daniel had lied to her. He had lied about everything. His wife's death wasn't a tragedy. It was a murder. And he knew. He must have known. The cold anger she'd seen in him, the clenched fists. It wasn't grief. It was a desire for revenge, but where did she fit in? Why buy her? Why the public spectacle of a marriage? Was it to protect her, or was it to control her? To keep her close, to use her as leverage against Morton Clay? She felt a wave of nausea. The dress she was wearing, Catherine's dress, suddenly felt suffocating, like the dead woman's hands were clutching at her throat. She ripped it off, throwing it in a corner, and pulled on her own tattered dress. It was a symbol of her old life, a life of poverty and hardship, but at least it was honest. It wasn't a lie. She had to get out. She had to run. But where would she go? Back to Cedar Ridge, where the sheriff was clearly in Morton Clay's pocket? Into the wilderness, where she had nearly died once before? And what about her sisters? Running away would save herself, but it would condemn them. No, she couldn't run. She had to fight. She had to uncover the truth. The next morning, when Daniel came into the main room, he found Sarah stoking the fire, the diary hidden safely under the mattress of her cot. She met his gaze with a calm she did not feel. "Good morning, Mr. O'Brien," she said, her voice even. "Daniel," he corrected gently. "Please, call me Daniel." She just nodded, her mind a whirlwind of suspicion. She watched his every move, searching for cracks in his carefully constructed facade. He seemed the same as yesterday, quiet, gentle, sad. But now she saw the tension in his shoulders, the fleeting shadows in his eyes. He was a man playing a part, and she was his unwilling co-star. A few days later, a rider came from town. It was a boy from the general store, and he carried a letter. It was for her. Her heart leaped into her throat as she saw the familiar, elegant script of her eldest sister, Elizabeth. She tore it open, her hands shaking. Daniel watched her from the porch, his expression unreadable. The letter was a cry for help. It confirmed her worst fears. Mary Catherine, her gentle sister, had tried to escape the merchant who'd bought her. He'd caught her and beaten her savagely. The twins, Hannah and Rebecca, were being held at a saloon in a town called Dusty Creek, forced into a life of degradation. Elizabeth herself was safe. The rancher who'd bought her was a decent man who planned to marry her properly. But she was desperate, helpless to save their other sisters. At the bottom of the page, there was a hastily scrawled postscript, almost illegible. "The man from the river knows the truth. Trust no one. The man from the river." Daniel's ranch was on the river. The warning was clear. Don't trust him. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she read about her sister's suffering. But they were not just tears of sorrow. They were tears of rage and of a cold, hard resolve. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes blazing. She had to play her part. She had to see what he would do. She held out the crumpled letter. "My sisters," she choked out, letting the genuine pain in her voice mask her suspicion. "We have to help them. Daniel, please, I have to save them." She watched his face carefully for any sign of deception. He read the letter, his jaw tightening, his knuckles turning white. It was the same anger she'd seen before, the anger from Catherine's diary. He stood up, his decision made in an instant. "Then we'll help them. he said, his voice a low growl. "Pack your things. We ride at dawn." It was the perfect response. The response of a noble hero, a loving husband. But Sarah saw it for what it was. A performance. He wasn't doing this for her. He was doing it for his own dark purpose. This rescue mission wasn't about saving her sisters. It was about moving his pieces across the chessboard, and she was going with him, not as a grateful wife, but as a spy in the enemy's camp. She would play his game, but by her own rules. She would let him lead her to her sisters, and along the way, she would unravel the web of lies he and Morton Clay had spun. She would find out what really happened to Catherine O'Brien, and she would make them all pay. The ride to Millerville, where Mary Catherine was being held, was a tense 2-day journey. Sarah rode the gentle mare Daniel had provided, her back straight, her senses on high alert. She answered his questions politely, made small talk about the landscape, and all the while she was studying him, cataloging his every word, his every glance. He talked about his childhood in Missouri, about his dream of building a life in Texas. It was a well-rehearsed story, smooth and believable, but Sarah listened for the things he didn't say. He never spoke of Morton Clay. He never spoke of his business dealings. He never spoke of the anger that simmered just beneath his calm surface. They found Mary Catherine at a boarding house above the general store. She was on her knees, scrubbing the front steps, her movements slow and pained. Her face was a canvas of purple and yellow bruises, and one of her arms was in a crude sling. When she saw Sarah, she let out a sob that was half pain, half disbelief. "Sarah? Is it really you?" Sarah leaped from her horse and ran to her sister, wrapping her in a gentle hug. "We've come to take you home," she whispered, her heart breaking at the sight of her once vibrant sister, now so broken and frail. A thin, rat-faced man with cruel little eyes emerged from the store. It was Prescott, the merchant. "Here now! What's this? That girl is my property. I paid good money for her. I've got papers." Daniel dismounted, his movements deliberate and menacing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I'm willing to buy her contract," he said, his voice cold as a winter night. "She ain't for sale!" Prescott snarled, but he took a step back, intimidated by Daniel's sheer presence. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I can see the uses you have for her," he said, his gaze flicking to Mary Catherine's bruised face. He reached into his coat. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah thought he was reaching for a gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick leather wallet. "You have 2 choices," Daniel said calmly. "You can take my money and we walk away. Or you can explain to the new circuit judge, who happens to be an old friend of my family's, why this young woman looks the way she does. I hear he's particularly harsh when it comes to matters of assault." It was a brilliant bluff. Or was it? Sarah didn't know, but Prescott's bluster vanished. He saw only a man with powerful connections and a barely concealed capacity for violence. The negotiation was swift. Prescott greedily snatched the $30 Daniel offered and scurried back into his store like the rat he was. As they helped a weeping Mary Catherine onto Daniel's horse, she whispered something to Sarah. That man, Prescott, he kept talking about his boss, a man named Clay. He said Mr. Clay owned this whole town and that he was the one who arranged the auction. The web was getting wider, more tangled. Morton Clay wasn't just a bidder, he was the puppet master pulling all the strings. Their next stop was Dusty Creek, a wretched hive of a town that seemed to be held together by mud, whiskey, and despair. The saloon where Hannah and Rebecca were being held was the biggest, loudest building on the street, a place called the Snake Pit. Daniel spent a day watching the place, his eyes missing nothing. He learned the routines, the comings and goings of the owner, a vicious man named Snake Morrison. We can't just go in there, he told Sarah and Mary Catherine as they huddled in a grimy hotel room. Morrison has too many men. It's a fortress. So what do we do? Sarah asked, the frustration boiling inside her. We can't just leave them there. Daniel was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on some distant point. When he finally spoke, a strange, cold smile touched his lips. Every fortress has a weakness, he said, and Morrison's weakness is greed. The plan he devised was audacious and incredibly dangerous. He had learned that a high-stakes poker game was happening at the saloon the next night, a game Morrison himself would be playing in. Morrison is a cheat, Daniel explained, but he's not as smart as he thinks he is. I'm going to join that game, and I'm going to beat him. You can't, Sarah protested. It was a poker game that destroyed our family in the first place. Your father played a crooked game and lost, Daniel said, his voice hard. I'm going to play a crooked game and win. He turned to Mary Catherine. While I'm in the game, I need you to create a distraction, a big one, something that will pull every guard and patron out into the street. Then he looked at Sarah. And you. You're the most important part of the plan. When the distraction starts, you're going to slip in the back, go upstairs, and get your sisters. You'll have 5 minutes. No more. Sarah's blood ran cold. He was sending her into the lion's den, alone. Was this part of his plan? To get her out of the way? To let her get caught? The next night, the air in Dusty Creek was thick with tension. Sarah watched from the hotel window as Daniel, dressed in clothes that made him look like a wealthy cattle baron, walked into the snake pit without a hint of fear. Hours passed. The saloon grew louder, more raucous. Then, just after midnight, a brilliant orange glow lit up the sky. Mary Catherine had done her part. She had set fire to the stables behind the saloon. Shouts of "Fire!" erupted. Men poured out of the saloon, their faces panicked, the street filled with chaos. This was her chance. Her heart pounding, Sarah slipped out of the hotel and ran through the back alleys, the smoke stinging her eyes. She found the rear entrance to the saloon, just as Daniel had described. The door was unlocked. She crept inside. The downstairs was empty, chairs overturned, cards scattered on the tables. The smell of stale beer and fear hung in the air. She found the stairs and raced up them, her footsteps echoing in the silence. A long, dark hallway stretched before her. A single, burly guard stood in front of a door at the far end. He hadn't run outside with the others. He was loyal, or well paid. Sarah froze. The plan hadn't accounted for this. She was trapped. Just as panic began to set in, she heard a sound from downstairs, a single, sharp crack. It sounded like a gunshot. The guard at the end of the hall tensed. He hesitated for a moment, then cursed and lumbered down the stairs to see what was happening. Sarah didn't wait. She ran down the hall to the door he'd been guarding. It was locked. Desperate, she threw her shoulder against it. It didn't budge. She kicked it, her boot connecting with the wood with a loud thud. From inside, she heard a faint cry. "Hello? Is someone there? Hannah? Rebecca?" She called out, her voice cracking with relief. She heard frantic scrabbling from the other side, and then the sound of a bolt being drawn. The door creaked open. Hannah and Rebecca stood there, their faces pale and thin, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. They threw their arms around her, sobbing. "We have to go, now!" Sarah urged, pulling them down the hallway. They clattered down the back stairs and burst out into the alley. The fire at the stables was now a raging inferno, casting dancing, demonic shadows all around them. The whole town seemed to be there, trying to fight the blaze. They made it to the horses they'd hidden a block away. But as they were mounting, a new sound cut through the chaos. A gunshot, much closer this time, followed by a man's scream of pain. Then they saw him. Daniel. He emerged from the alley beside the saloon, a smoking pistol in his hand. His face was grim, his knuckles were bloody, and there was a dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. He'd been shot. Snake Morrison and 2 of his men appeared behind him, their guns drawn. "You're not going anywhere, O'Brien!" Morrison roared, his face contorted with rage. You and those girls belong to me! Daniel shoved Sarah and her sisters toward the horses. Ride! He shouted, turning to face Morrison's men. He fired his pistol, providing cover as they scrambled onto their horses. Sarah hesitated, her eyes locked on Daniel. He was wounded, outnumbered. Leaving him felt like a betrayal, no matter what his true motives were. Go! He yelled again, his voice strained with pain. Get them to safety, that was the deal. The deal? What deal? There was no time to ask. Morrison's men were advancing. With a final, agonizing look at Daniel, Sarah spurred her horse into a gallop, leading her sisters out of the hell that was Dusty Creek. They rode hard into the night, the sounds of gunfire and shouting fading behind them. They didn't stop until the sun began to rise. They were miles away, hidden in a rocky canyon. Mary Catherine tended to the others, her own pain forgotten in her relief. Hannah and Rebecca, though still shaken, were free. But Sarah couldn't feel the victory. All she could see was Daniel, standing alone against 3 armed men, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. He had sent her to her sisters. He had created the distraction. He had faced down the guards. He had taken a bullet for them. None of it made sense. If he was in league with Morton Clay, why would he fight Clay's associates? If he was using her as a pawn, why would he risk his life to save her sisters? Unless his war wasn't with her. It was with Morton Clay, and he wasn't her enemy. He was her enemy's enemy. As she sat there, huddled with her sisters in the cold morning light, a terrifying new possibility began to dawn on her. Maybe Daniel O'Brien wasn't the monster she thought he was. Maybe he was something far more complicated. And maybe, just maybe, by saving her from the auction block, he hadn't been buying a pawn. Maybe he had been recruiting a soldier. They waited in the canyon for 2 days, nerves frayed, provisions running low. The sisters huddled together, sharing stories in hushed tones, the trauma of their ordeal slowly giving way to the relief of freedom. But Sarah's mind was a storm. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel, bleeding, facing down Snake Morrison's guns. Had he survived? Or had she led her sisters to freedom only to leave their rescuer dead in the dirt of Dusty Creek? The guilt was a physical weight on her chest. On the 3rd morning, as the sun crested the canyon wall, they heard the sound of a lone horse approaching. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed the small hunting rifle Daniel had packed in her saddlebag, her hands trembling as she checked the load. Her sisters scrambled behind the rocks, their faces pale with fear. A single rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon. It was Daniel. He was slumped in the saddle, his face ashen with pain and fatigue. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, and his shirt was stiff with dried blood. But he was alive. Sarah lowered the rifle, relief washing over her so intensely her knees felt weak. She ran to him as he slid wearily from his horse. "You're alive," she breathed, her hand hovering over his wounded shoulder. "Takes more than a gutter snake like Morrison to kill me," he rasped, a ghost of a smile touching his lips before he winced in pain. "Are they all right? Your sisters?" "We're fine," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to you, Daniel. What happened back there? Who were those men?" He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. The mask of the quiet widower was gone. In its place was a raw, weary honesty. "They work for the same man you do," he said, his voice low. The words hung in the air between them. The same man you do. He thought she was working for Morton Clay. The realization hit her like a physical blow. All this time, she had been watching him, suspecting him, and he had been doing the exact same thing to her. "I don't work for Morton Clay," she said fiercely. "He's the man who destroyed my family." A flicker of something, surprise, relief, crossed Daniel's face. "Then you need to tell me everything you know," he said. "Right now." Huddled around a small, smokeless fire, the story came tumbling out. Sarah told him about her father's gambling debts, the crooked poker game, the way Sheriff Bradley had eagerly overseen the auction. She told him about Catherine's diary, the cryptic entries about M, the fear, the sickness that wasn't a sickness. As she spoke, Daniel's expression grew darker, harder. The lines around his eyes deepened, not with sorrow, but with a cold, simmering fury. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "I found the diary, too," he finally said, his voice a low growl. "A week after I buried them, I thought I was going mad with grief. I tore the house apart, and I found it hidden under a loose floorboard in the nursery." He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw the full, unvarnished truth of his pain. It wasn't just grief. It was the agony of betrayal. "Catherine wasn't just my wife," he said, the words torn from him. "She was Morton Clay's sister." Sarah gasped. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture more monstrous than she could have imagined. "Clay was always ambitious, always ruthless," Daniel continued, his voice laced with venom. "But Catherine never saw the darkness in him. She loved her brother. When they inherited their family's fortune, she trusted him to manage her share. That fortune is what built his empire. It's what bought him Sheriff Bradley, what paid for men like Prescott and Snake Morrison." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "A few months before she died, Catherine found out what he was planning. He'd discovered a rich vein of silver on your father's land. He knew your father was a weak man, a gambler, so he orchestrated the whole thing. He and Bradley set up the poker game, planning to take the land and dispose of your family one way or another to ensure there were no competing claims." "Dispose of us?" Mary Catherine whispered, horrified. "He couldn't have you laying claim to land he considered his," Daniel said grimly. "The auction was his way of scattering you, breaking you, making sure you could never unite and challenge him." "And Catherine?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer. "She was going to expose him," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "She was going to go to the U.S. Marshals. She told me the night before she got sick. I told her to wait, to let me handle it. I was afraid of what he would do, but I never imagined he would poison his own sister." He looked down at his hands. "The doctor said it was cholera. The baby was born weak, and he only lasted 3 days. I believed it. I buried my family and nearly buried myself in grief. Then I found the diary, and I knew I had been a fool." The truth was out, a raw, ugly thing lying in the middle of their small circle. Daniel O'Brien wasn't a monster. He was a man hollowed out by loss and driven by a single, all-consuming purpose: revenge. "Why me?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you buy me at the auction?" "Because when Clay saw you on those steps, so defiant, so unbroken, he knew you were a threat," Daniel explained. "He bid on you himself. He would have locked you away somewhere you would never be seen again. I couldn't let that happen, and I realized you were the key, you and your sisters. You are the rightful heirs to that land. Your testimony is the only thing that can bring him down. I bought you not to own you, Sarah, but to arm you." "You let me believe you were a monster," she said, the accusation soft but pointed. "I had to," he countered, his gaze intense. "I didn't know who you were, what you knew. I thought Clay might have gotten to you, promised you something. I had to be sure. I had to test you, sending you into that saloon. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I had to see if you had the courage to fight." A new understanding dawned between them, forged in the fire of their shared truth. They were not master and pawn. They were allies, two wounded souls united against a common enemy. "So what now?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling but determined. Daniel looked at the 4 sisters, at their faces marked by hardship but alight with a newfound fire. "Now," he said, a grim smile on his face, "we take back what's yours. We're not going to run. We're going to go back to my ranch, fortify it, and wait for Clay to come to us. And when he does, we're going to give him a war he'll never forget. The journey back to Daniel's ranch was different. The silence was no longer one of suspicion, but of shared purpose. They were a small, strange army, a wounded avenger and 4 sisters who had been forged into fighters. When they arrived, the ranch no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a fortress. Their fortress. They spent the next week preparing for the storm they knew was coming. Daniel, despite his injury, was a master strategist. He showed them how to handle weapons, how to reinforce the doors and windows, how to use the terrain to their advantage. The sisters, who had once been taught only to cook and sew, discovered new strengths within themselves. Mary Catherine, who had learned about herbs and poultices from a kindly doctor in Millerville, began creating noxious concoctions that could be thrown to create disorienting smoke. Hannah, who had always had a way with animals, found she had an uncanny aim with a slingshot and a bag of heavy river stones. Rebecca, the quietest of the sisters, revealed a shocking talent with the hunting rifle, a skill her father had taught her in secret long ago. She was a natural sharpshooter, her hand steady, her eye true. And Sarah became the commander. She worked alongside Daniel, absorbing his strategies, coordinating her sisters, her mind sharp and clear. The defiant girl from the auction block had become a leader. One evening, as they sat on the porch cleaning their weapons, Sarah looked at Daniel. "Catherine's dress," she said quietly. "You can burn it, if you want. I won't wear it again." Daniel shook his head. "No," he said, his voice soft. "She would have liked you, Sarah May. She would have been proud of what you're doing. She always said love wasn't like a pie, where every piece you give away means there's less for everyone else. She said it was like a flame. The more you share it, the brighter it burns." He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not just the ghost of his past love, but the dawn of a new one. Their fragile alliance was deepening into something more, a bond of respect, of trust, and maybe, just maybe, something that could one day heal them both. The peace was shattered 2 days later. A rider was spotted on the horizon, not one, but a dozen. At the head of the group were 2 men, the sneering, arrogant Morton Clay and the corrupt, bloated figure of Sheriff Tom Bradley. They had come to wipe the McKinnon problem and Daniel O'Brien off the face of the earth. "They're here," Daniel said, his voice grim as he watched them from the window. He handed Sarah a loaded pistol. "Remember the plan. No mercy." Sarah's heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She looked at her sisters, their faces set and determined. They were not victims anymore. They were warriors. "For our family," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. "For Catherine," Daniel added, his eyes like chips of granite. The battle for Cedar Ridge had begun. The dozen riders fanned out, surrounding the small ranch house. Morton Clay sat on his horse like a king surveying his domain, a cruel smirk on his face. Sheriff Bradley, looking nervous, began to shout, "O'Brien, you're under arrest for kidnapping and theft of property. Come out with your hands up." Daniel let out a short, harsh laugh. "You'll have to come and get us, Tom, but I warn you, this property is defended." Clay spurred his horse forward. "Enough games, O'Brien. You have something that belongs to me. 4 somethings, to be precise, and the deed to a certain piece of land. Give them to me, and I might let you live." "The land belongs to the McKinnon sisters," Sarah shouted from a window, her voice clear and strong. "And we are not your property." Clay's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of pure fury. "Kill them," he snarled to his men. "Kill them all. Burn the house to the ground." The first volley of shots splintered the wood of the house. Sarah and her sisters hit the floor, the air filling with the smell of gunpowder. This was it. The moment of truth. "Rebecca," The west window, Daniel commanded. Hannah, the front porch. Mary Catherine, get the smoke pots ready. Sarah, with me. The small house erupted into a fortress of defiance. Rebecca, perched at the west window, fired the hunting rifle with deadly precision. A rider cried out and tumbled from his saddle. The others, shocked that they were facing real resistance, faltered for a moment. From the front porch, a series of heavy river stones, launched from Hannah's powerful slingshot, cracked against the heads of two more men who were trying to approach on foot. They staggered back, dazed and confused. Now, Mary Catherine, Sarah yelled. Mary Catherine, her face grim with determination, lit the fuses on two clay pots and hurled them out the front windows. They shattered on the ground, releasing a thick, acrid smoke that billowed outwards. The men coughed and choked, their eyes streaming, their attack thrown into chaos. "They're blind!" Daniel yelled, his eyes blazing with a fierce joy. "Press the attack!" He and Sarah fired their pistols into the swirling smoke, the sounds of their shots punctuated by cries of pain and panic from Clay's men. This wasn't the easy slaughter they had expected. They had walked into a hornet's nest. Sheriff Bradley, a coward at heart, had seen enough. "I'm not dying for this," he shrieked, turning his horse and galloping away, abandoning his master. Clay screamed in rage, firing his own pistol wildly at the house. "Useless fools! Get in there!" But his men were wavering. They were hired thugs, not soldiers. They had signed on for intimidation, not a full-blown siege against a family that fought like cornered wolverines. Daniel saw his chance. "Hannah! The horses!" Hannah slipped out the back door. A moment later, a wild cry echoed from the barn. She had released their horses, plus the stallion Daniel had ridden from Dusty Creek. The animals, spooked by the gunfire and smoke, stampeded directly towards Clay's remaining men, creating a chaotic whirlwind of flailing hooves and panicked whinnies. It was the final straw. Two more of Clay's men turned and fled, following the sheriff. Now it was just Morton Clay and a handful of his most loyal gunmen, their faces grim as they realized their overwhelming advantage had vanished. "We're going out there," Daniel said to Sarah, his voice low and intense. "We end this now." "We go together," she replied, reloading her pistol. Daniel kicked open the front door and they stepped out onto the porch, side by side, pistols raised. The smoke was beginning to clear. Across the yard, Morton Clay stared at them, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. "You!" he spat at Sarah. "A 16-year-old girl! You did this!" "No," Sarah said, her voice ringing with authority. "You did this when you decided our lives were worth less than a vein of silver in the ground." Clay raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Sarah's heart. "You should have stayed sold," he hissed. In that split second, everything slowed down. Sarah saw the flash from the barrel of Clay's gun. She heard a roar of rage beside her. Daniel threw himself in front of her, a human shield. She felt the impact as his body was thrown back against hers, a sharp, terrible grunt of pain escaping his lips. He collapsed at her feet, a dark red stain blossoming on his chest. "No!" Sarah screamed, a sound of pure agony. Clay's face twisted into a triumphant sneer. He had won. He had killed his enemy. But as he savored his victory, he failed to notice the silent figure at the corner of the house. Rebecca. Her face was pale, her eyes were filled with tears, but her hands holding the rifle were rock steady. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Across the yard, the pistol flew from Morton Clay's hand as the bullet shattered his wrist. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, clutching his ruined hand to his chest. His remaining men, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve completely. They threw down their guns and raised their hands in surrender. The battle was over. Sarah fell to her knees beside Daniel, her hands pressing against the wound in his chest, trying to stop the bleeding. "Daniel, no, please," she sobbed, her tears falling onto his pale face. "Don't leave me. Not now." He looked up at her. his eyes glazed with pain. He tried to speak, but only a bloody cough came out. "Help is coming," Mary Catherine said, kneeling beside them, her hands already working, applying a makeshift bandage. "But we have to get him inside." As they struggled to carry Daniel's dead weight into the house, they heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Not 2 or 3 horses. Dozens. Sarah's heart froze. Had more of Clay's men arrived? But the riders who crested the hill weren't thugs. They were soldiers. U.S. cavalry, their blue uniforms and gleaming sabers a glorious sight against the morning sun, and riding at their head was a stern-faced man with a U.S. Marshal's badge pinned to his chest. The Marshal took in the scene at a glance, the surrendered gunman, the wounded Morton Clay clutching his shattered hand, the body of the man Rebecca had shot. "It seems we arrived just in time for the cleanup," the Marshal said, his eyes landing on Sarah. "Are you Sarah May O'Brien?" Sarah, stunned, could only nod. "We received a telegram 2 days ago. From a Daniel O'Brien," the Marshal continued, pulling a folded paper from his coat. It detailed a conspiracy involving land fraud, coercion, and the murder of one Catherine Clay O'Brien. It named Morton Clay and Sheriff Tom Bradley as the ringleaders, and it said to expect trouble here at this ranch. He looked down at the bleeding man on the ground. "I take it this is Mr. O'Brien. He's a very thorough man." Sarah stared at the Marshal, then at Daniel's pale face. He had known. He had planned for this all along. The stand at the ranch wasn't a desperate last resort. It was a baited trap. He had lured Clay and his men into an open act of war, right where the law could find them. He had made sure there would be witnesses to their crimes. He had orchestrated his own justice, and he had been willing to die to see it through. The Marshal's men rounded up Clay and his thugs. Clay, sputtering and cursing, was hauled to his feet. "You have no proof!" he shrieked. "It's my word against a dead man's!" "Not just his word," a new voice said. A wagon had pulled up behind the soldiers, and climbing down from it was Elizabeth, Sarah's eldest sister, her face set and determined. And beside her was her new husband, a kind-faced, respectable rancher. "My sisters and I are the proof," Elizabeth said, her voice ringing across the yard. "We will testify to everything he's done, and so will I," she added, glaring at Clay. "I overheard you and my father's business partners planning the whole thing." But the final piece of evidence came from Sarah herself. She walked to where the Marshal stood over the cowering form of Morton Clay. From her pocket, she pulled a small, leather-bound book. "And then there's his sister's diary," Sarah said, her voice cold as ice. "She wrote it all down, how you threatened her, how you poisoned her, how you killed her baby." She handed the diary to the Marshal. The look on Morton Clay's face was no longer one of anger. It was the face of a man utterly, completely defeated. The game was over. He had lost. As the soldiers led him away in chains, Sarah rushed back inside to Daniel's side. He was still breathing, his pulse a faint, thready flutter beneath her fingers. "He's strong," Dr. Webb, Mary Catherine's future husband who had arrived with the Marshal's posse, said after a quick examination. "But the bullet is deep. We need to get him to my surgery in town. It's his only chance." For Sarah, the next few days were a blur of fear and prayer. She sat by Daniel's bedside, holding his hand, talking to him, begging him to come back to her. Her sisters were a constant presence, bringing food, offering comfort, handling the aftermath of the siege. The community of Cedar Ridge, shocked by the revelation of Clay's evil, rallied around them. The people who had once stood by and watched her be sold now offered their help, their support, their apologies. Justice was swift. With the diary, the testimony of the sisters, and the confessions of Clay's own men, the case was airtight. Morton Clay was sentenced to hang. Sheriff Bradley, captured on the road, was sentenced to life in prison. The McKinnon land and the silver beneath it was rightfully restored to the 5 sisters. They were no longer destitute orphans. They were wealthy, powerful women. They had their futures back. But none of it mattered to Sarah if Daniel didn't wake up. On the 5th day, she was sitting by his bed, dozing in a chair, when she felt a faint pressure on her hand. Her eyes snapped open. Daniel was looking at her. His eyes were clear, the fever gone. A weak smile touched his lips. "Did we win?" he whispered. Tears of relief streamed down Sarah's face. She leaned down and kissed him, a kiss that was full of desperation and hope and a love that had been forged in the crucible of violence and fear. "We won," she whispered back. "We won everything." Spring came to the O'Brien ranch, and with it, new life. Daniel's recovery was slow, but with Sarah nursing him, he grew stronger every day. The anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet peace. The ghosts of his past had been laid to rest. The house, once a place of sorrow and suspicion, now overflowed with laughter. Mary Catherine married Dr. Webb. Hannah and Rebecca were courted by 2 decent, hard-working brothers from a neighboring ranch. Elizabeth and her husband became pillars of the community, using their newfound wealth to help build a new school and a new church. The 5 sisters were together, and they were whole. One evening, as the sun set, Daniel and Sarah sat on the porch swing. His arm was around her, holding her close. The physical wound in his chest was healing, but more importantly, the deeper wounds in their souls were beginning to mend. Sarah rested her head on his good shoulder. For months, a secret joy had been growing inside her, a secret she had been waiting for the right moment to share. "Daniel," she said softly, "the house is going to get a little more crowded." He looked at her, confused. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "Catherine was right," she said, her voice filled with a happiness so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "Love is like a flame. It just keeps growing." Understanding dawned on Daniel's face, followed by a look of pure, unadulterated joy. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. The man who had lost one family was being given another. Months later, Sarah gave birth to a healthy, bawling baby boy. He had his mother's fiery green eyes and his father's determined chin. They named him James Patrick O'Brien, honoring the memory of the brother he would never know, and celebrating the future that stretched before them all. Years passed. The ranch prospered. More children came, filling the expanded house with love and chaos. The story of the auction, of the siege, of the 5 sisters who took back their lives, became a legend in Cedar Ridge, a tale of courage, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of family. A family built not on blood, but on choice. A family forged in fire. A family that started on the darkest of days, on a dusty courthouse square, when a grieving stranger made an impossible offer, and a defiant young woman had the courage to accept. She had been the last daughter, the one left behind, but in the end, by refusing to be a victim, she had become the savior of them all. The story of the McKinnon sisters and the quiet stranger who changed their lives is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, courage can light a flame that burns away the shadows. It shows us that true family is not about who you are born to, but who you are willing to fight for. If you were moved by their incredible journey of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We have so many more stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, and you won't want to miss a single one. Let us know in the comments below what part of the sisters' fight inspired you the most.